right. So for the next few weeks, I don't precisely know how many because we're going to look at how Hosea is being used in the New Testament. So we're jumping out of the book of Hosea, but at this point we're going to read some New Testament passages, read the Old Testament Hosea passages they come from, and try and discern how the New Testament is looking at Hosea. It's not always as clear-cut as we think, and we have to learn some things about how they were thinking. It's not overly complicated, but especially the way that Paul, Hosea is used in 3 places in the New Testament. Matthew 2, Romans, is it 9 or 10? I think it's 9, but it's Romans 9 or 10. And then 1 Corinthians 15. So we're going to look at these 3 passages over the next few weeks and try to understand what's going through the minds of the authors when they're looking back on examples of Old Testament prophecy and what they consider prophecy, why they consider that prophecy. And we'll look at it and compare it to a couple of different ways that Matthew was quoting the Old Testament, not just Hosea today, to try and understand specifically how he's using Hosea. But the big picture for today is that Matthew quotes just Hosea 11:1b, the last half of that one verse, as a typological prophecy. The idea is that he establishes the story of Jesus as a summary and a fulfillment of Israel's corporate story, their corporate identity, and their corporate purpose. Everything that Israel is as a people, he's telling the story of Jesus as an individual, getting that story right, and he applies Hosea 11:1 to that idea and calls it prophecy. So it shows the reader that Jesus alone is the redemptive king who can, through his second Exodus, bring an end to the Old Testament exile, redeem Israel, all of humanity, and the very cosmos itself, all creation, through the work of Jesus that you get throughout the book of Matthew. But we're not going to look at the whole book of Matthew, so we're really going to focus on this. But I don't want you to forget all of this as we go through it, because we've talked about the second Exodus motif. We've obviously talked about exile. We'll talk a little bit more as we go through the other prophets and start looking at how they do the same thing Hosea is doing. But we're jumping ahead now 750 years to Matthew's time from Hosea's time, and he's now looking back on Hosea and reading an end to exile through the life and work of Christ. But we're going to start here. I probably should have started in Matthew 1:18. So 1:18 all the way through 2:23 is one big section in Matthew. That's like his genealogy ends in 1:17, and then he starts his actual narrative. And this is the first chunk of his narrative, but we'll pick it up in verse 1. And I have bolded in Old Testament quotations. As we go through this and read it, that's what I want you to pick up on. Now, so Matthew begins chapter 2 by saying, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east come to Jerusalem. So, no, the after time is Jesus has already been born. The Magi were not there when Jesus was born. We're jumping ahead probably about 2 years, and I'll point out why in just a second. So if you see the manger scenes and they put the Magi in there, technically it's incorrect. But you see how Hollywood and storytelling over time collapses stuff down together. Okay, so I wanted to point that out. The Magi asked, verse 2, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose," past tense. "We have come," present tense, "to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So King Herod is a bad guy, as this chapter is going to play out. If he ain't happy, nobody's happy. So he gets upset, so all of Jerusalem is living in terror. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, so the Jewish religious leaders, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they replied, "for this is what is written, this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. Out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." That is Micah 5:2. Okay? So they quote it, and Matthew includes it here, because, and if we go back to verse 1, Jesus has already fulfilled this prophecy. So they're picking up on this 2 years later. Matthew's pointing this out, that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until they stopped over the place the child was. Now, they go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the major capital where the king is. That's where they expect to find it. Bethlehem is almost not quite 5 miles outside of Bethlehem. So this leg of the journey is quick. They've been traveling from the east. They've probably been traveling for 2 years. And it's not 3 guys. It's probably a big caravan entourage, for the record. So they haven't gone that far in this last scene. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with the mother Mary. Now, this word for child is the Greek word for like a toddler. Roughly, usually somebody about 2 years old, which is why this is commonly expected to be roughly about 2 years after the actual birth of Jesus. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and they've stayed there for 2 years. They bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night, and he left for Egypt, where they stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." And I bold and underline this because this is Hosea 11:1b. But he keeps going and he quotes some more prophecy. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious and he gave orders to kill the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. What time did the star rise? When the child born? About 2 years ago. So Matthew is actually telling us that this story has nothing to do with Jesus' actual birth. Then what was said, through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." He got up, he took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, up north, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was written, or what was said through the prophets, plural, that he would be called a Nazarene. This is unique among these passages. And I just want to point out in chapter 1, where the section opens, is also a prophecy there. And there are 5 prophetic Old Testament ideas that Matthew is linking together. This passage that we're going to talk about is the 3rd of 5. So that's part of Matthew's context that we need to keep in line here as we try to discern what this means when he says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Because he's only quoting this portion of Hosea 11b. The whole verse says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son." So the first question you always want to ask when the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament, what is the Old Testament context? The Old Testament context for Hosea 11 is just the historical exile of Israel from Egypt. Pure and simple. There's nothing tricky about that idea. But there is something tricky about the idea of saying, how exactly does it work about Jesus if that's not Hosea looking at the future and saying the Messiah will one day flee to Egypt and then return? How does that prophecy work? So it's not a messianic prophecy like Micah 5:2 that Matthew actually quoted in 2:6. Out of Bethlehem will come a ruler, right? The Messiah will be born there. Understanding the context of Hosea 11, if you backed up to look at Hosea 10, Hosea summarizes Israel's glory days. The early days when they turned from wickedness, before they turned to wickedness, I should say, things were actually good in a lot of ways when they first got into the land. That's Hosea 10. Hosea 11 picks it up right where Hosea 10 left off. And he says, when you were young, Israel, I took care of you. You were my son. I loved you. And my love was demonstrated to you because I stepped in, beat up your enemies, beat their gods, beat their human representatives, and pulled you out of Egypt on my own, right? You didn't come up with a plan yourself. You didn't achieve it yourself. I stepped in and saved you because I loved you. And then it starts in verse 2, and we're going to read 2 through 11. Hosea 11, 1 through 11 is one big section. We need to understand Old Testament context by reading it. So, out of Egypt I called my son, but the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them on cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them, I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek and bent down and feed them. Will they not return to Egypt? And will not Assyria rule over them because they refused to repent? A sword will flash in the cities. It will devour their false prophets and put an end to their plans. My people are determined to turn from me, even though they call me God Most High. I will by no means exalt them. So, a bit of a summary of these 7 verses here, 2 through 7, and verse 8 coming up in just a second. Okay, my computer's making noises. So, this is a big lament. I think this is supposed to be through verse 8. No, it is verse 7. Okay, so after he says, Israel was my son, I saved Israel out of Egypt, Hosea, in God's voice, laments that Israel has wandered just further and further away from their loving Father who rescued them from Egypt. So, verse 5 and 6 together emphasize that exile is certainly going to come about because they didn't want to turn from their sins when God graciously and lovingly sent people to tell them that they've sinned, broken his laws. And verse 5 explicitly states that they will return to Egypt and Assyria will rule over them. Physical exile did not merely take place in Egypt. When Israel conquered the north, they dispersed the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom all around the Mediterranean world that they controlled at that time, which Assyria is, I think of them as the first world superpower. And I mentioned this when we first got into background on Hosea and the minor prophets. There are plenty of other empires that existed long before Assyria. But this Mediterranean world, Assyria is the first one to essentially conquer it all. Not every piece of land, but the first empire to dominate the entire Mediterranean world. The entire Fertile Crescent, you would say, from like Babylon all the way through Mesopotamia, down south into Israel, and on into Egypt. They're the first world superpower to really do that. Otherwise, the empires are more like Egypt. Egypt controls a lot of land outside of its national borders. They have people that pay tribute to them. But they left them alone. Part of Assyria's conquest was they kicked you out of your land and moved you to other places and split your people up so that you couldn't get together and rebel against them. So that's what they did to Israel. In the New Testament, if you come across the term diaspora or dispersion, that's what it's referring to. The 10 tribes of Israel that are dispersed by Assyria all throughout the world and across the next 7 centuries just move and migrate around, and they're everywhere. That's exile. It does not matter if they're strictly in Egypt. The geography isn't really the point. We don't want to press that too specifically. Yes, there are plenty of Jews living in exile in Egypt, especially by New Testament times. But the real point is, if we take this more metaphorically about exile, that physical location's not the point. Being ruled over by corrupt pagan powers again. That's the real point of exile. It doesn't matter where you're at. As long as you're ruled over by people that don't obey Yahweh, you're stuck in exile. In a very real sense, this is what they're thinking when Jesus comes along. Okay? Carla?
Wasn't Assyrian at the time the most brutal, cruel, vicious
Absolutely.
conquerors?
Yes.
In fact, they originated crucifixion, and the Romans took it to the next level.
There is some historical evidence to suggest that an early form of crucifixion was definitely created by Assyria. It's hard to know what, because they had so many different brutal forms of conquering their enemies.
They were awful.
They were the worst. Every empire progressively gets better in comparison to Assyria. What happens when they conquer it? So Babylon overthrows Assyria and becomes the dominant empire. And when they come along and they conquer Jerusalem, instead of dispersing the Judahites around everywhere, they disperse them all to one location in Babylon. Then when Cyrus of Persia conquers the Babylonian Empire, Cyrus takes the throne, he actually says, I'm going to let everybody go home. And it's not just the Jews in Babylon. That's the Old Testament focal point. But he's saying everybody throughout the empire that's been living in exile from their homeland, whether by Assyria, whether by Babylon, whatever your historical homeland is, I'm going to let you go back to it. But you have to obey these laws and stuff. So that's how it happened. But absolutely, Assyria is the most aggressive and the worst. So
that's sort of an underpinning of who's going to rule you, right?
If you want the real metaphysical idea that the prophets are getting at is to say, if you want pagan gods this much, I'll give you pagan gods. I'll kick you out of my land, and I'll send you into land where you have so many pagan gods, you cannot stand it, and you'll have to stay there and suffer under their paganism and the fact that they treat you like this because they think you're less than they are. That attitude of slavery and domination, even if they're legally free, and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, depending on where they're at in history and location. And yet, in verse 8, after this lament, this guarantee of exile, a part of which is physically returning to Egypt, but really the idea is domination under pagan control, God immediately shifts his voice again. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. 4 rhetorical questions to change God's mind on a dime. Admah and Zeboim. These were small towns located in the Transjordan area during the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. So these were some of the minor places overthrown when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. He didn't just destroy 2 cities. He destroyed the entire Transjordan, including Admah and Zeboim. So he's making a comparison to say, how can I just outright and utterly annihilate you the way that I did these pagan people? The answer is essentially that I'm not going to treat you that way, because verse 9 continues, says, I will not carry out my fierce anger. I will not devastate Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you, and I will not come against your cities. Basically, it's not to say you're not going into exile. That's not the point. The exile is going to happen, but the point is, despite the fact that you're going into exile, I'm not utterly going to destroy you like I did these people. So you have to understand, even while I carry out my just judgments against you, I'm going to make a distinction between you as my people who have screwed up and those who were never my people. Those people that were never my people, I destroyed them outright. You're going to be decimated for sure. You're going to lose everything that makes you a people, but I'm not going to utterly destroy you so you can't recover, which is why verse 10 can continue with the redemptive motif. They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come from Egypt, trembling like sparrows, from Assyria, basically from anywhere that they've been exiled. Fluttering like doves, I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. So, this portion of the passage as a whole, 8 through 11, is describing God's coming redemption after the exile is over. It first makes a distinction, And God is very, very gracious to say, you deserve to be outright destroyed. I gave you more privilege, I gave you more rights and responsibilities than any other people. You treated me like this. You deserve to be destroyed, but I just can't do it. I love my son too much, Ephraim, so I'm not going to destroy you. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and redeem you anyways. So God cannot truly give up on Israel, so that after the exile has served its disciplinary and judgmental purposes for Israel's sins, God will graciously bring about the relational redemption between them described in the second Exodus motifs. Just to go back to a little bit of this, it's not specifically about where they're at. It's not specifically about coming back to Israel.
They like birds.
It's about God giving them another shot to be His people again, regardless of location. But it does seem to hint, if I go back to here, at least here, and this wasn't the case in chapter 3, but at least here, he does seem to have this idea of settling in their homes again, may actually imply returning to the land of Israel at some point. But even then, the emphasis is really the relational connection. So, that's the Old Testament context. This is all of chapter 11, a little bit in light of chapter 10. Any questions on the Old Testament context of Hosea 11? So then the question becomes, how is Matthew reading Hosea 11? And why does he quote just one brief line out of this passage? As I've already made mention in the introduction, his hermeneutic is, this is pure typology. So what is a type? What is typology? That's the question. We've talked about this before with Jude and 2 Peter because they both do this. Can anybody remember that far back and explain to me in whatever language you want, what is a type or an antitype for the New Testament aspect of it? Let's just start with the Old Testament. What is an Old Testament type in New Testament interpretation? Can anybody remember?
Is it a preview to an event that's coming?
That's along the lines of it, yes. A preview.
Close.
You're on the right track. Anybody want to take a shot? Okay, it's been a while, and so that's okay. This isn't the kind of language that comes up every day. I'm probably the only person in the church that remembers this stuff day to day because it's just the kind of nerd that I am. Rachel, you're looking at notes or something. I love it. If you've got it, read it out.
Google.
Okay. I'm good with that. That's a starting point. Let's work with it. Yeah, use the tools.
Type refers to the original or model that something is based on, while the antitype is the simile in another context.
Okay, good. So that moves us towards the correct answer. In most basic terms, a type is a nonverbal prophecy. If Micah 2, that the Messiah will explicitly be born in Bethlehem, is a verbal prophecy about the Messiah, a type is a nonverbal prophecy that often is going to look at characters, going to look at story plots, we're going to look at specific examples that make a point about what God has done in the past to tell us what God is likely to do or is doing in the present, immediate past, or sometime in the future that He might do again. So even the idea of Jesus being the Lamb of God is really a type. Because the Old Testament sacrificial system, as the author of Hebrews says, is a shadow of things to come. So that was more in line with the language that you were using, Carla.
Yep.
So the antitype is just what they call the New Testament's reality that corresponds to the Old Testament pictures. There are a lot of types in the New Testament. You're familiar with some of them, even if you don't know the word type. So Adam is a type of Messiah to come in both 1 Corinthians, but more specifically in Romans 5. If you ever read Romans 5, the way that Paul reads the character of Adam is to say Adam is like the first human and the head of humanity, right? And so he's looking at Jesus as a new head of a new humanity. So I think Romans 5 might be the only place, I forget the verse, maybe around verse 14, where he actually uses the word type. I don't think in 1 Corinthians 15 he refers to Adam as a type, but he's still doing typology. He's still making that same prophetic comparison there. The author of Hebrews does this with Melchizedek, an extended typological interpretation of a guy who shows up in two passages in the Old Testament, Genesis 15 and Psalm 110. And so it's an extended typological idea that the Messiah would be a king and a priest, because Melchizedek shows up in Genesis 15. He's king and priest at Salem, which was Jerusalem, long before David took it over and made it his capital there. Rachel.
So in the NIV in Romans 5,
Does he use the word pattern?
it uses pattern. I think that's a much more illustrative
So
term for that.
the Greek word is typos, so they've essentially just translated it. That's why we get typology. That's why they call it that.
Yeah.
But yes, the NIV translated as pattern. And so they're seeing historic patterns play out across history, just the repetition of typical patterns that God works. Any good historian reads history and knows that patterns play out across history, right? What's the joke or the sentiment? Harsh times. What? Go ahead. If what were you?
I would say if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat.
Yes, and so that's a part of why history repeats itself, because not everybody learns the historical lessons, so they can't break patterns. But I was thinking in terms of also harsh times create good men create good times create weak men create harsh times, and harsh times create good men again. It's just the pattern of peace and war going back and forth. And what kind of men and people solve what problems? And they're perfectly predictable in a way. And so modern historians didn't come up with reading history in patterns. The idea is that what God did in the past is in some sense what he does in the future, because God has not changed. He is still the creator, and he has still functionally created things to function along certain parameters. So the wheel of time turns, and the same things happen over and over again. And so the Hebrews are reading their history from like the exile in like 586 to the time of Jesus. They're looking back at their history and they're saying, certain things play out. Certain things are happening over and over again. And it tells us where God is working and what he might be doing in our present or what he might be doing in the future. So Matthew is picking up on that and reading Israel's story about going down to Egypt and then coming back to Israel as Jesus doing something there individually that corporate Israel did. Let me read an extended quote from Dr. Craig Blomberg, who was a professor of mine at Denver Seminary. And in this wonderful book, Commentary on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, Dr. Blomberg does the commentary for the book of Matthew. He's written a separate commentary for Matthew back in like the 90s that still holds up and is really good. So let me read for you what Dr. Blomberg, now retired, has said. This commentary is about 19 years old, but something that can survive 19 years and will continue to survive after this is a really good commentary. So he says, the recognition of a correspondence between New and Old Testament events based on a conviction of the unchanging character of the principles of God's working, that's a type. That he's defining what a type is there. The original event need not have been intentionally viewed as forward-looking by the Old Testament author for believing Jews merely to discern, I should read these with the right punctuation. The original events need not have been intentionally viewed as forward-looking by the Old Testament authors for believing Jews merely to discern striking parallels between God's actions in history, especially in decisive moments of revelation and redemption, could convince them of divinely intended coincidence, that Israel had been delivered from Egypt, that Israel would again be exiled there, but again restored, and that the child believed to be the Messiah also had returned to Israel from Egypt, formed too striking a set of parallels for Matthew to attribute them to chance. God clearly was at work orchestrating the entire series of events. The logic is not identical to the classic proof of prophecy, like Micah 5:2 being quoted there. Those arguments are not identical here to these arguments of much of church history, but given that theistic worldview that it presupposes, it was every bit as compelling in first century Judaism. So if you actually did look into first century Judaism, you would see typologies everywhere, and which is why they come up in the New Testament, because they're all Second Temple Jews from this era.
So this is related, but slightly off center. Is this why the larger Jewish body doesn't accept the Messiah status of Jesus? Because they've been looking at these types for 2 millennia and seeing, well, God always came through, we always did this, and this happened. And then when Jesus comes, he kind of breaks the pattern, even though he's fulfilling the pattern that they've been told about this entire time, but they don't believe it.
I'm not entirely sure if that's how big of a reason that would be or not to certain Jewish communities. I will say that in their history, after the destruction of their temple in 70 AD, in the Roman Jewish wars, and in the generation after that, after the Bar Kokhba revolts, where the Romans finally kicked them out of the land again and exiled them away, Rabbinic Judaism throughout that time and immediately after abandoned a lot of Jewish components that existed in that time. To what extent they abandoned typology, I am not sure. And to what extent they would claim that New Testament typological interpretation is invalid, I do not know. But it doesn't matter, because whatever they rejected after the fact, in part they did so because Christianity was too intelligent, it was making too much sense to the Jews and their interpretive ideas for that time. So they intentionally and deliberately abandoned a lot of things. And that's what Rabbinic Judaism starts, and what modern Rabbinic Judaism now takes its cues from. But I want you to understand that it wasn't always that way in Judaism. The New Testament gospel authors in particular are Second Temple, first century Jews. They thought a certain way, and Jesus is also one of them, and he is responding a certain way so that he can connect and make certain points and ideas with his people. That is the only interpretive valid things that you need to take into consideration when it comes to Jesus. If you take in or reject things from his day and accept things that come after, that's an anachronism in your interpretive process, and you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. Everybody has anachronisms in their interpretive understanding. We are 21st century Americans. We do not think and reason like Second Temple, first century Jews. So we have to learn these things so that we can read Matthew correctly and understand the story of Jesus that he's telling. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has to do them. But eventually you're going to learn, oh, wait a second, that idea that I hold so closely actually comes from hundreds of years after Jesus. It has nothing to do with Jesus. I need to let that go because that's an anachronism for reading text hundreds of years before that idea came along. And I could do plenty of those, and I don't even know them all. But I'm always catching myself with those. This is probably one of those. Probably plays some extent of why modern Jews will claim Jesus is not the Messiah. But if you can get them to actually read their own Hebrew teachers during specific times before the rabbis, you can actually see why they had to abandon it to convince their Jews not to go over to Christianity in bulk. Okay. So for Matthew then, the interpretive idea is that Jesus is a type of Israel doing Israel's story. Now, in Hosea, the term son is used 5 times, 6 possibly included here, but it's never in a messianic sense in other Old Testament places. As like Psalm 2, Psalm 89, 2 Samuel 7, 14 for sure. The term son in Hosea never refers to a future messianic person. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the Davidic king and how he uses that language. But Hosea only ever uses the term son in the sense of a biological offspring. Only in 11:1, I think is the sixth and final place that he uses it, where it's a non-biological offspring, but it's no less real father-son relationship between Yahweh and Israel. So it's a metaphorical sense, it's not instead of a biological sense. Everywhere else, is in the opening chapters, it's King so-and-so, son of King so-and-so, twice. And then it's his kids, the son of Hosea, and all this stuff. So it's biological, it's not metaphorical, except 11:1. But even if it's metaphorical for Israel here, how does that make it typological? What Israel is corporately and communally, Jesus is meant to be as an individual. This is how Matthew, in that entire chapter, is telling the story of Jesus. Israel went to live in Egypt, but ultimately enters the Promised Land. Jesus embodies the same basic plot points of that story. Israelite boys were killed by a corrupt pagan power, but one deliverer survives and ends up saving Israel. The same historical thing took place when Herod says, go kill all the boys 2 years and younger. So Jesus is, for Matthew, not just a type of Israel, he's like a second Moses. This is another way you could say it and describe it. Thus, he's leading a second Exodus idea around himself. Matthew is never going to come out and say, in the voice of Jesus, or Jesus is never going to come out and say, hey, I'm here to end the exile and bring the second Exodus. But everything that he is doing and the way that Matthew is telling his story as a Jew to Jews, because Matthew is the most Hebraically dominant of all four Gospels, is designed to telecast this exact fact. And it's easy for us to miss it. One, if we don't pick up on these motifs as being part of Old Testament prophecy, like we've already talked about in Hosea 3, when redemption comes. But also, if we don't pick up on how Matthew and other authors are telecasting their ideas themselves. This will make perfect sense to his audience. Everything Israel was meant to be and failed to live up to in their Old Testament, in our Old Testament, Jesus actually fulfills, in the sense that he completes it. He did for them what they could not do for themselves. Not just us. We're often very kind of focused on, oh, Jesus died for me because I couldn't pay for my own penalty. Well, none of us can ever fully live up to anything God wants us to be on any level. That doesn't mean we're not responsible to try. That doesn't mean his spirit isn't within us to actually help us. But in our past, we have all failed at every possible level. Jesus succeeded at every possible level. He is the ultimate Israelite, fulfilling and doing everything that God meant. And so when Matthew starts with this idea from Hosea 11:1b, is to say he's living out the same story, but he's getting right whatever everybody else got wrong. So Matthew tells the story of Jesus in such a way that his Jewish audience sees their own national history recapitulated within the Messiah individually. His opening Exodus outline throughout these chapters, and we only read chapter 2 for the sake of time, is one, he has a supernatural birth, and that reflects the birth of both Isaac in particular, but also Moses and Samuel. The author of Hebrews looks back at Moses and says one of the reasons that they hid Moses was because they could tell something was special about this kid. That's the author of Hebrews looking back. That was a common idea about Moses reading Exodus 1 and 2 there. So maybe there's something supernatural about his birth, but in particular, just take Isaac, for example. When do I have it on a slide? Am I going to have time to get to it today? Let's assume that I'm going to get to it next week. So let me just point out, Isaac is a supernatural birth in the Old Testament in the sense that Abraham and Sarah are barren. She has gone through menopause. She is physically incapable of having children. So God comes along and says, you are the perfect couple because the nation that I'm going to build from your bloodline cannot be attributed to pure human means. I am supernaturally going to let you have a baby in your old age beyond, when all your energy levels drops and your capacity to have children is gone, I'm going to give you a child. That is a supernatural birth. So, in chapter 1, a virgin birth is an even greater supernatural level. When in the Old Testament, when God says, I'm going to make a new people for myself, starting with the supernatural birth of this child, Isaac. Then when you tell your readers an even greater supernatural event, a virgin birth came along, you are telling your audience that they would pick up, as Hebrews, a greater, more supernatural event to create a new humanity once again is happening here. That's the point of chapter 1. And then he goes on and he tells the story, like Moses, of an edict to kill baby boys happened. So a new exodus is happening. Chapter 3, Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River to begin his ministry and his anointing of the Holy Spirit stuff. Well, Israel crossed that same river on dry land. They entered the land to conquer. So the beginning of Jesus' ministry and the conquering of the powers of evil start with his baptism, which is why all 4 stories start with a baptism. It is not insignificant if you understand your Old Testament. And then in chapter 4, you get the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. And those 3 temptations are mirroring perfectly Israel's failures in the Exodus in the book of Numbers. They grumble about not having bread. Hey, if you're hungry, turn these stones to bread. They worship a golden idol. Hey, put God to the test and throw yourself off this building and all this. It makes perfect sense if you understand your Old Testament story. Why he's being tempted in those ways and how he overcomes and continues to succeed where everybody before him fails. So the difference is that Jesus is a second greater Isaac. He's a second greater Moses. He's a second greater Joshua, bringing a true and lasting conquest against evil. He succeeds where every previous generation in Israelites failed at some way, shape, and form. If you read the book of Kings and 2 Chronicles, more so the book of Kings, but the book of Kings is structured in such a way as to share these stories about this king. Every king, whether of Israel, where there are no good kings in the north, or even the southern kings of Judah, where despite how good Hezekiah, David are, Josiah, Uzziah, all these good kings, they all fail in the end in some way, shape, or form. It always ends with their failure. He writes that book that way because he's leaving open when the future king is going to come, the possibility that the future king is going to actually get right what all these previous kings got wrong, which is why you're still looking for a Messiah. 2 more slides and then we'll finish up here. Let me just end with this, and we're going to pick this up next week because this is very, very important. So I'm going to spend at least a Sunday on this. Prophetic quotation in the New Testament era was often a shorthand way to make a larger point. So when you keep in mind that oral communication was dominant back then, not written communication, writing documents of the first century were expensive and time-consuming to produce. They take much longer because you didn't have a computer, you couldn't copy and paste, you didn't have a printer where you could mass produce, and you didn't just go grab paper, put them in a machine, and click print, and then in 10 minutes you've got an entire book printed out. Authors had to find a way to make points within a very little amount of physical space and on only so much physical paper. So you have this much physical paper, you've got this much room to make your point. So next week I want to talk about, finish up this discussion on how 11b is being used by suggesting that minor quotes like this are actually a shorthand way for telling the audience, hey, you should go back and read everything here around in and involving Hosea 11 here, maybe 10 and 11. Why does he quote from Jeremiah 31? Well, because 30 and 31 of Jeremiah actually have something bigger to say about redemption and the end of exile. So we're going to look at those next week, just to get a better idea of what Matthew is doing and how he's using Hosea 11b.